welcome, a very, very warm welcome to this wonderful panel discussion we're going to have today. I'm really looking forward to this because it is most certainly of its time. We are living in the most extraordinary times. These are times when we need serious discussion and debate about the dynamics at play, which are significant, extensive, and add already to a circumstance which is challenging and also put into some pressure. So I was delighted when the Refugee Council asked me if I would step up and host this discussion. My name is Julia Streets, very, very quickly. I'm a businesswoman. I run my own organisation. I'm an entrepreneur, but I'm also a professional host. And so I'm delighted to be navigating us through this conversation today. Great to have your company. Wonderful to see some of you comment in chat where you're joining us from. Very, very warm welcome. We'd love to hear your comments, love to hear your questions. There will be time to do that as well. So what I'd like to do, if I may, is just set a bit of context and then to welcome in our speakers. We have two from the Refugee Council, and we have two external speakers as well to add some richness to this reality and the quality of the discussion today. So let's just talk about the nature of the discussion. And this is entitled A Warm Welcome, Standing with Those Fleeing Violence and Conflict. The Refugee Council, as many of you will know, are on the front line supporting refugees as they arrive into the UK. And we are delighted to welcome also two external speakers who will be giving us real insights into the lived reality of those fleeing from the Ukraine. So thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about them in a second. But first, if I may, I'm sure many of you know the Refugee Council very well, but if I may just give you a little bit of context. It's a leading charity working with refugees and people seeking asylum in the UK, which was founded in 1951, following the creation of the UN Refugee Convention. Their work is supporting all of those who have made the difficult decision to flee conflict, flee violence, and also persecution in order to rebuild their lives here in the UK. And the Refugee Council works with some 13,000 women, men, and children every single year. Individuals who are desperately seeking safety. And from the moment those refugees arrive into the UK, they're here to provide some really critical services, provide crisis advice, support mental health counselling, and offer practical support to help people settle and to integrate into their new communities. They're also specialists in helping refugee children who arrive unaccompanied into the UK, and also working with refugees and partners to fight for improvements to the already stretched asylum protection system. So with the fighting in the Ukraine intensifying day by day, more than 4 million people have been forced to make the heartbreaking decision to flee their homes and abandon everything they know in search of safety. Sadly, they add to the already record number of people displaced by war around the world. And as many people look to rebuild their lives here in the UK, the Refugee Council's work with refugees has never been more urgent and indeed more important. It won't surprise you, therefore, to know that there is an emergency appeal. The details will be in the chat, but I will take a moment, if we may, if you just to explain how you can, of course, donate to help all the people I've just described and to welcome Ukrainian refugees and help them recover from the trauma of these experiences and rebuild their lives. So you can donate at refugeecouncil.org.uk. So I'm delighted to introduce you to our stellar panel today, and allow me to start, if I may, with Enver Solomon. He is the Chief Executive of the Refugee Council. Enver, great to have your company today. Those of you who don't know Enver, allow me just to give you a little bit of colour into his role, his day job. He has a wealth of experience in the charitable sector. He's worked for many different charities, and prior to that, he was also a BBC journalist for more than 10 years. He has served on advisory boards for the Department of Education, the HM Inspector of Prisons, and the Office of the Children's Commissioner, as well as chairing a number of cross-sector coalitions, including the End Child Poverty campaign, and also 5 years as chair of the board for Asylum Aid. So Enver, great we can have your company today. Really looking forward to your thoughts as we go through this conversation. Now, I mentioned we have two external speakers as well. Renae Mann, actually I'll come to Renae in a second, but Maria Montague is the Deputy Director of the Ukrainian Institute here in London, but currently joins us from Germany. Again, just to give you a little bit of colour into Maria's experience and also focus, she plays a pivotal role in leading the Institute's work in supporting Ukrainian refugees and UK hosts, working closely with other Ukrainian community organisations in the UK, including, of course, the Refugee Council. At the beginning of the invasion, she set up the Ukrainian hub for the Institute, which is now providing vital information and support to thousands of refugees and diaspora. And she's recently spent time in Poland and Kyiv, and will be bringing these first-hand experiences to the discussion. So Maria, thank you for taking the time to join us today. Great to have your company. Great to see you. I'm also delighted to say we're joined by Dr. Olga Onuch, who is a senior lecturer and associate professor in politics at the University of Manchester. Based in the UK, Olga specialises in the comparative study of protest politics and elections in democratizing states in Latin America, and also, most crucially for this discussion, in Eastern Europe. She is an expert on Ukrainian politics. She's a member of the Strategic Advisory Group tasked with advising the government and also the President of Ukraine. Her book, Mapping Mass Mobilizations, published in 2014, investigates mass mobilization both in the Ukraine and the Argentina. So, Olga, it's wonderful to have your company. Thank you again for joining us, this incredible panel today. Thank you. And last but no means least, I'm delighted to welcome Renae Mann. Now, Renae is out in the field every single day. She leads the services for clients and has been with the Refugee Council since 2021. More than 20 years of experience working with people seeking asylum, refugee and migrants in her casework. She began her career working with people seeking asylum to access housing and legal representation in her home city of Brisbane in Australia. And she is a trained social worker and originally came to London to work for an inner London borough to support unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. So Renae, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today. So I hope all of you who have tuned in will agree that this is going to be not only an important discussion, but also we'll be bringing real insights from the field and from advisors who are actively seeking to bring some reality to the discussion, and also from experts at the Refugee Council who are thinking every single day and actively involving themselves in driving programs to support this. Again, we have the chat function open. We would very much welcome your questions. Please do post there. We will be allowing time for questions as we go through, but if you have any thoughts, don't hesitate, throw them into the chat and we'll pick those up as we navigate our way through the conversation as well. And I wondered if Maria, I could start with you. I was talking earlier about your experiences and also your area of focus as well. I wonder if we could start with you, and then I'm going to bring Olga into the conversation as well. Share your thoughts about, well, let's call it a situation update. Talk to us about what's really going on right now.
Sure. Thank you, Julia, and thank you for having me as part of this discussion. I think probably the right place to start is just to remind about quite how unimaginably horrendous the situation is in Ukraine right now. The evidence that's been uncovered from towns like Bucha help us to understand the extent of the atrocities that have been committed by Russian forces against civilians and that continue to be committed every single day. There is no safe place in Ukraine now. Just yesterday in Lviv, which is in Western Ukraine, quite near to Poland, it's considered to be one of the safest places in Ukraine, and a lot of Ukrainians from elsewhere in the country have been fleeing there. There was a missile strike there yesterday with civilian casualties. So I think it's just important to remember, and we're thinking a lot. I'm thinking a lot about the Ukrainian refugees that I'm in touch with every day, and the hosts and the people arriving. And it's very hard to even process quite how horrific the situations and bloodshed, everything that the Ukrainian refugees have been fleeing in Ukraine. So I suppose that's really the starting point. But with regards to the situation for refugees, it's been a very overwhelming time for the Ukrainian Institute London. We've got very low resources and we've been working really, really hard to try to respond. We're actually a cultural charity. We usually do cultural events, but given the situation and just the floods of emails we've been receiving every day, because we do have the language skills and we do have the community kind of base. We've been doing our absolute best to try to support refugees and share the right information. I mean, we'll come onto this in the discussion, but of course the visa systems and the support that is in place it's nowhere near enough, and these visa systems are not fit for purpose, and it's putting so much pressure on communities, organizations like the Ukrainian Institute to try to respond in this situation. But I suppose finally, I would just like to say that we really are grateful for the work that's being done by the Refugee Council, because we're very new to this. We haven't got any experience of supporting refugees in the past. And now it makes sense for us to be part of, core to those efforts. And I'm sure Ola will tell us more later about the Ukraine Hub that she has set up, bringing together Ukrainian organizations across the country. And it's really, really inspiring what people have been coming together to put in place. But unlike the Refugee Council, we don't have long experience of the kind of support that's needed in the long term as well. And this is all new for us. And there are a lot of people working around the clock to try to do everything to support, but we don't necessarily have all of the experience needed to manage, manage all of these inquiries professionally. So it's really important, I think, this combination of charities like the Refugee Council with the experience and Ukrainian community organizations who understand Ukrainians and know the language and understand the experiences for Ukrainians right now. Those two together are going to be really, really important for us moving forward.
Well, I wonder if that's a beautiful moment to bring in Olga. Very keen to hear your thoughts. I mean, and Maria, thank you for setting us off with such a clear context of what's going on, and also what this means in terms of community relations and also partner involvement as well. Olga, keen to hear your thoughts.
So yes, I study Ukrainian political engagement and migration for the better half of the last 16 years here in the United Kingdom, but I am Ukrainian. My family is in Ukraine, and whenever I start speaking about it, my bottom lip quivers, so I'm going to have to move on. But this is extremely also personal for me. And the Ukraine Hub UK that we set up pretty much in the first 3 days following the Russian invasion of Ukraine was to ensure that there is coordination in the community sector of Ukrainian community organizations and leaders across the United Kingdom. We count 64 organizations across the UK, across Ukrainian university student associations, again, across the whole of the United Kingdom. And we set up a higher education institution expert task force where we not only wrote policy briefs, we met with individuals like Enver and Renae, who helped us understand how to best respond as a community of experts, scholars, and students and organizations across the United Kingdom. And we've been monitoring the situation on the ground in Ukraine and on its borders, obviously for the last 55 plus days. And to say that the situation is dire is an understatement. The IOM currently estimates that we're just about to reach 5 million mark of displaced individuals because of the war outside of Ukraine. 5 million. We are not even 2 months into this war at this point. In terms of internally displaced in Ukraine, which is 7.5 million internally displaced individuals in Ukraine, 2/3 of that are children. The UNICEF estimates that 55 children are displaced every single minute of every single day of this conflict. The IOM director has said that the scale of what is happening and this forced displacement far exceeds any worst case scenario and planning for it. And this is why I think both the United Kingdom's, the government's response to this it needs to be put into perspective, but also the incredible work that refugee sector organizations such as the Refugee Council do is important here. Just to put this into perspective, because I know people sometimes don't truly understand the scale of these things. According to the UNHCR data finder, it took about 3 years of the war in Syria to get to 3 million externally displaced refugees. In Ukraine, this happened in the first 2.5 weeks following Russia's invasion. We are now at the place where we were several years into the war in Syria when it comes to the displacement of individuals. And yet, in the United Kingdom, people are waiting on weeks and weeks on end for their visas to be processed. Just to give you an update on what we have done in the United Kingdom so far is accordingly, we've only processed, only 16,400 individuals have arrived in the United Kingdom. If we're talking in terms of 5 million displaced outside of the borders of Ukraine, clearly there's something here that's going awry when it comes to the Homes for Ukraine scheme and the family scheme in terms of the slowness, the complexity of the procedures, the lack of language support in these procedures. And that, I think, is where we are today. A lot of people working very hard on the ground, including the Ukrainian community, refugee organizations. Definitely the Refugee Council has been so supportive of our community leaders, but we are certainly not living up to the scale of the tragedy that is unfolding in front of our eyes.
Well, I'm going to come to Enver in a second, just to talk about, the government's response. I mean, you mentioned there, Olga, about the visas, for example. But before we do that, Renae, can I bring you in here? I would love to hear from you about, kind of when we talk about the sort of situation update from your point of view, from the Refugee Council's point of view, is, give us a sense of what you're facing every day.
Yeah, really just building on, thank you very much. Just really building on the points that Maria and Olga just shared, that we've got the most unfair and ineffective refugee protection system in the UK since it was created in 1951. So the system of support that should be in place for any person seeking asylum or refugee protection in the UK is just not in place. The basics aren't there. So the basic safe routes to protection aren't there for Ukrainians that should be there. They're not getting access to refugee protection. It's a managed migration route. And this is not the way that you respond to a crisis. And the essential services like housing and legal advice to live with safety and dignity and to rebuild their lives just aren't in place. So we're seeing very piecemeal policy solutions being put in place that actually in effect serve to marginalise and isolate people and deny them a voice in choice in what they need to be able to stay safe and rebuild their lives and connect with their loved ones. And at worst, it endangers their lives. And that's some of the key concerns for us. We've been partnering with local authorities, with Ukrainian-led organisations like Olga's and Maria's to be able to provide wraparound services for those people coming through the Homes for Ukraine scheme, as we already do for people who've arrived in the UK from Afghanistan and elsewhere in the world. But that's just a tiny minority of people who are going to receive that source of support. The other key area and area of concern for us is because of these holes in our system that should be there to protect everybody who needs refugee protection. We're focusing on crisis intervention, so intervening as early as we can to ensure that every person is able to access safe and secure housing and financial support to make sure, regardless of their route of entry, to ensure that they get the right support they need when they need it. And doing that in partnership with other frontline organisations, with local authorities, in particular Refugees at Home, who you may have heard of, and other Ukrainian-led organisations, particularly in London, where the need is being most keenly felt at the moment, although we're aware that there are other pockets of particular need as well. Alongside of this direct service delivery response, which is absolutely essential to ensure that nobody falls into destitution or is harmed in any way. We've got real concerns about exploitation, particularly of single women and children, through the holes in the current policies that are in place around the schemes. We're also working alongside of other frontline organisations and Ukrainian-led organisations to strengthen that local frontline capacity, to make sure that we're not just responding today, but we're going to be here in the longer term for people, and making best use of the resources that we all have and the skills and strengths that organisations have, but lean in together to identify shared operational and practice issues and come up with shared solutions as well, because we believe that together that ensures that every person seeking a protection is going to be able to access that support in the longer term. And also we can advocate for the policy changes that are needed to ensure that we have the right system of protection for every person seeking refuge in the UK when they need it. I'll stop there.
And well, thank you all for your kind of opening remarks, really, because I think for me, sort of listening to your comments, hearing about the reality, the escalation, the speed of the crisis, let's call it that. I mean, those are my words, my specific words, but also beginning to think about, you know, the collaboration that's taking place, but also the short term, medium term and longer term thinking. And you were talking there, Renae, about the policy advocation as well, or advocacy. Enver, you've been sort of sitting, listening patiently to all of this, but you know there is a question coming your way, which is, you know, about the government's response. You know, is it sufficient? Love to hear your thoughts on, you know, what is the current government policy doing, and is it sufficient?
Yeah, thanks, Julia, and thanks so much to Maria and Olga, and for everyone that's joining us. I mean, you know, I just don't think we can underestimate the scale of what we're facing here. Olga really well set it out. And in the first couple of weeks, you know, UNICEF were estimating that a child was displaced every minute. You know, a child became a refugee for every minute because of the numbers, which is just extraordinary if you think about it. The government was late to respond. You know, it was caught on the back foot. Europe, the EU waived visas, and our government still hadn't brought forward a proper scheme, a proper response. The first thing it did was a pretty paltry response. It decided to extend visas to people who had Ukrainians in the UK with immediate family members. So their immediate family members could get a visa to come to the UK, emphasis it being a visa. Then they got pressure from their own Conservative MPs. So they said, okay, we'll extend it to extended family members. But these, again, were just family members. It took a number of days until they then came forward with this Homes for Ukraine scheme, which again was a visa scheme. And it was a visa scheme that required a Ukrainian individual to find a UK member of the public who would sponsor them. And then the form had to be put together online by them together. Now, just let's think about what that visa scheme means. You know, when any of you travel to India or to another country, you have to get a visa. You know, getting a visa is not a simple, straightforward process. You have to work out how you have to go through it. You then have to do it. If you're a Ukrainian, you know, you don't necessarily have an internet connection, you don't speak any English. Going online to do a 30, 40, 50 page visa form where you've got to upload all your documents, which you may not have with you. You may not even have birth proof of your children. There was an extraordinary situation of a woman that gave birth to a child in Poland, having fled. She wanted to come to the UK with her newborn child. Her newborn child didn't have the documentation to prove she was a UK citizen, so a Ukrainian citizen, so she couldn't apply for a visa. To get that documentation, she would have had to go back into Ukraine. I mean, how ridiculous is that? Into the war zone to register her newborn child, to get the documentation to apply for a visa. So as Maria has said, and as Olga said, we've got a visa system which is wholly unfit for purpose to respond to a humanitarian crisis. It's just not what we need. We need a mechanism which allows people to get to the UK safely as quickly as possible through a frictionless scheme. The EU waived visas. We've been calling, we got Oxfam, Save the Children, IRC and the big international NGOs to support us in calling for a visa waiver program, or to put in place a simplified emergency humanitarian visa scheme. The government could do this at a stroke of a pen. Doesn't need primary legislation. They can change immigration rules. Priti Patel could do it in the next 10 seconds if she wanted to. It's a political decision not to do that. And let's remember that if a Ukrainian now arrives in Dover, having made a dangerous journey on a boat across the channel, they will be deemed under this government's new proposals that are going to go through the Lords and the Commons in the next couple of weeks, their new borders bill, they will be deemed a criminal for having illegally entered the UK. Just pause. They have come from Ukraine with nothing, overland, they couldn't get a visa, they arrive in Dover, they have illegally entered the UK, they will be criminalised and could face up to 4 years in prison. That is how this government wants to differentiate between those that come through so-called authorised routes, a visa route, or on from Afghanistan through a resettlement route, or those, many of whom who can't access those routes, have to come overland. They will be criminalised. And even worse, just to finish, under the scheme that was announced over Easter, this government could deem them of having gone through a so-called safe country, France, Italy, Spain, say to them, you should have stayed there. Therefore, we're going to rule your case what is described as inadmissible, and we're going to send you to Rwanda. We're going to transport you as though you're a form of human cargo to Rwanda, where we will dump you and you will have to negotiate the Rwandan asylum system. So that is our government's response. Very poor response in relation to a humanitarian crisis, but then wanting to criminalize those Ukrainians who can't even access the visa scheme.
Well, Olga, can I bring you in here? Because I noticed you were sort of nodding to some of Enver's remarks there. And I'm very keen to kind of move the conversation about, and it's been great hearing Enver's comments about the reality of what's going on today, and therefore what we must be very aware of, very mindful of, and also where we should focus. I'd love to get your thoughts on, from your point of view, where must we focus?
Thank you. I think, it's hard not to get a little sad after hearing, especially the last few points Enver made, because if you can imagine people who might have themselves personally fled direct violence, rape, just horrible, horrible situations, to then be placed in this, to be somehow a pawn in this political game is really frightening. But I would like to tell you a little bit about who these people are first, just so that we can even further place into context who we're talking about and what we need to do. First of all, this is a vulnerable population. These are predominantly women with young children. There are cases of unaccompanied minor, and I know Renae and Enver have been particularly working on this issue from the very first day when we met in that very first week. This was a priority area for them, and elderly. But the elderly group is least likely, according to our research and assessment, to be able to make the journey even out of Ukraine, let alone to the UK's borders. But I think there's something very important here in the way that we've set up some of the support mechanisms for Ukrainians. This is a vulnerable group, traumatized. Support needs to be in place for well-being and psychological trauma treatment. There needs to be help with parenting and children going through trauma. If you are a mother that has escaped violence herself, you are dealing with your own trauma, let alone helping your children through that trauma. And of course, those hosting do not have training in these things either, right? So there's a lot of burden on local communities and hosts to help in something that is really, it needs professional assistance and government support. But who are these people otherwise? Well, I think it's really important to note that they have a strong sense of civic identity and state attachment in our research. And I would like to just give you one little piece of data from Ukraine. I know that this is not a data place, but I'm a researcher after all, so I'm very nerdy. We all know that the pandemic has hit support for democracy across Europe, right? We have seen levels of support for democracy drop everywhere, including in the United Kingdom. Let me give you the story about the Ukrainians that are desperately fleeing war right now. During the course of the pandemic, support for democracy has gone up by 16 points in Ukraine. Belief that it is your absolute civic duty to engage in elections went up by another 10%. Belief that it is your civic duty to engage in civil society organization and community engagement also went up by 12 points. These are the people that are coming to the United Kingdom that need our support. These are people that will not only integrate into the Ukrainian communities that already exist and into our local communities, be it in Manchester or Oxford or Coventry or Glasgow. They are the people that will then also contribute to our communities in a way that is incredibly important for us. So I think that is here. We need support for mothers, for children, education, psychological trauma support, but we also will be getting a great deal from these individuals who, once they are able to have a safe place, these are the types of people who in a pandemic decided, no, we're going to go double down on democracy. I mean, when I hear that data, I get shivers all the time. And as a Ukrainian, it makes me fiercely proud. But these are the people we're dealing with.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if I could bring in Maria at this point. I mean, you're nodding energetically to those remarks as well, and clearly that comes from spending real time with communities, and obviously building on Olga's comments about support for parenting and dealing with parenting and trauma and family support around that as well. Let's get your thoughts about, where do you see we must really focus?
Thank you, Julia, and thank you, Ola. Yes, I was nodding my head furiously because I feel all of that so much too, and there's so much to say. But I'm not Ukrainian. I actually studied Russian, and I was fascinated by Russian culture and history, and went to university to do Russian, basically assuming that Ukraine was pretty much an extension of Russia. I went to Kiev, and my year abroad as part of my languages degree coincided with the Euromaidan revolution, when for the first time I was made to think about what do European values mean, and what does it mean to fight for them, these values that we take for granted. And I think everything that Ola said about democracy and these values that Ukrainians know that they are fighting for, and also the civic engagement. Another thing that really drew me to get so involved in Ukrainian culture and various work, my whole career has been related to Ukraine one way or another, but what has inspired me so much is exactly this civic engagement that Ola was referring to, and the way that my peers were feeling this big responsibility for how to make society a better place. And part of that was about the national culture, but a huge part of that really at the core is this fight for democracy, for human rights, fight against corruption, everything that actually in the UK, I mean, that sort of responsibility to democracy and society is something that I really do absolutely agree with Ola's point that Ukrainians arriving will contribute to that. But at the same time, it's a bit difficult to know where to say to focus on, honestly, because it feels to me from the messages of despair that I receive every single day, I can't really pinpoint it. Help is needed everywhere. But I would say one of the things that is a bit more difficult to respond to is the language question, because a lot of people I know actually are wanting to come to the UK because they do know a bit of English. And I'm in Germany right now because, I mean, obviously it's a lot easier for Ukrainians to reach Germany. Some of my own relatives, and my partner is Ukrainian, so some of his relatives are now here, and friends of ours. But a lot of other people I know want to come to the UK because they do know a little bit of English, but very little. And even those people, when they do arrive, it's not enough English to be able to get by in day-to-day life. And even Russian in the UK, very few people speak Russian, let alone Ukrainian. And more Ukrainians now are, already it was majority, everybody in Ukraine speaks Ukrainian, but even those who were speaking Russian are more and more, especially now, deciding to speak Ukrainian. And I don't know what the stats are on Ukrainian speakers in the UK, but it's very low beyond Ukrainian. So I think that for the mental health, because I've also had a lot of inquiries from people wanting trauma counselling, but to find a Ukrainian speaking trauma counsellor in the UK is very difficult. And obviously services are starting to exist, but I think tapping into the Ukrainian communities that already exist that are very strong, and Ola is a great person to kind of reach out to, and this site that she's created of the Ukraine Hub, there is a list there of all of the Ukrainian community organisations across the UK. So I think tapping into that is really important.
Yeah, wonderful. And I just want to say, while you're sort of speaking, we're getting some great questions coming through into the chat. They're very much sort of picking up on some of the comments about dealing with trauma, dealing with family trauma, and also integration, but also the mental health and the well-being as well. Thank you to everybody for posting the questions. We are definitely going to allow time to come to these, because there's clearly a thread running through that, which is the government's response. So we will allow time for those, I promise. Please keep your thoughts coming. They're very, very welcome, and they're incredibly important. I wonder whether we could just move the conversation just on a fraction. I'm really keen to bring in Renae and Enver as well, just with your thoughts about what we're at risk of overlooking. We've heard there about sort of what we should focus on. And in the mix of this, it's a great way of teasing out some of the essence of the reality of what we should be mindful of as we think about what we're at risk of overlooking. Renae, can I come to you first of all?
Hi, and apologies for my wobbly screen. I'm having
Don't worry at all. I'm glad you could be joining us.
My phone today. what will we at risk of? I guess I would like to start with some positives. We've been talking about all the negatives. There's been, and really building on some themes coming out through Maria and Olga's points as well. There's been an incredible pulling together at the front line with local authorities and local communities, and that outpouring of public support. But what is missing, and I think this is the piece that we get concerned about in terms of safety nets, is really the coordination and the building of the capacity for people who perhaps have never worked in this space before, providing that quite specialist support that they're now being asked to provide. I think the things that we're at risk of missing as well are, and this relates to the pressures already within the system, is that local authorities were already under immense pressure in terms of supporting UK citizen communities as well as newly arrived communities. They need more support from government and clarity in terms of policies and procedures, but also that ability to coordinate. They know their local communities. They can draw in experts like ourselves, and then working with Ukraine-led organisations as well, to be able to provide that excellent wraparound support that people need. On the therapeutic point as well, it's absolutely essential that you have trained interpreters who can work alongside of trained therapists to provide that immediate crisis intervention supports, because if people get that immediate emotional support, they're often able then to move on and then be able to rebuild their lives. Not everybody is going to be traumatized for the long period. They're dealing with trauma and then often can then move on with their lives. Others will need longer term support, but that partnering of those two pieces is really key. I think safeguarding, I know that's been in the news a lot. It is our biggest concern. It's shared by local authorities. And so much of that is about making sure that you've got professional people who are able to provide that wraparound support prior to people arriving, making sure that they're arriving in a safe place and they have that ongoing support as they move through and rebuild their lives in the UK. I think the other piece is because people aren't here as refugees, they haven't got refugee protection status, they don't have automatic right to family reunion. We're talking about single mothers and their children being far away from their loved ones, their partners and their wider relatives. Absolutely, when they're thinking about their future, they're thinking about how they can reunite as a family. That is critical in being able for people to even think about the long term. So I think they're the sort of the three key pieces for me: coordination, expert support, and safeguarding and family reunion. All.
Wonderful, thank you, Renae. And Enver, it's a similar question to you, which is as you think about sort of on the higher level, the strategy of the Refugee Council, what are you concerned we might be at the risk of overlooking?
Well, I think my biggest concern is that we don't give every single Ukrainian that comes to this country the warm welcome, the support, and what they fundamentally need. And that the system fails, or it falls short in too many individual cases. So, for example, we already know that people that are arriving on the family visa scheme are ending up not being able to stay with family members. They're having some of them even to present as homeless to local authorities, and we're having to work with other charities to try and find them a host, somewhere they can go and stay, and then help them access benefits, because they're not entitled to any of this so-called wraparound support. Councils are not being funded to provide that to them. So imagine arriving here, being very vulnerable and ending up homeless. I mean, that is far from good enough, and that is a significant gap there. I think the other area is for those that come on the Homes for Ukraine scheme, which is a bold and ambitious scheme, and actually versions of it exist in Poland, where I was reading today that Poles are being paid a particular amount of money for every day they host a Ukrainian. What's happening with our Ukrainian scheme, the Homes for Ukrainian scheme, is that sponsors will be paid a fee, £350 per month. But those sponsors, and it's wonderful, as Renae says, that people have been so amazing in their desire to want to host, to want to sponsor Ukrainians. I mean, in a phenomenal outpouring, which says something about Britain's desire to welcome refugees generally. But many of those people will be doing it, going into it relatively blind. And, they do need support. They do need some basic training. They need to know how to meet the needs. They need to ensure that that process doesn't break down. Because imagine again, if if you're Ukrainian, you have a sponsor, you go and live with them, 2 or 3 weeks time, it breaks down. It doesn't work out for various reasons. You're then, where do you go? What do? You're facing potential homelessness. How do you navigate a complex benefit system? What happens if you haven't got the key piece of documentation, what is called a biometrics residency permit, which allows you to open a bank account so you can apply for benefits? These small things are so important, and that's why sponsors need advice and help, but that's why organizations like us need to work with those sponsors and with Ukrainians. And if Ukrainians are sponsored far-flung, they could be from the Outer Hebrides to Liverpool, right all the way down to the depths of Cornwall, will every local authority be commissioning services, support for every single Ukrainian? Again, we don't know. There will inevitably be a postcode lottery of support. So my fundamental point is we need to ensure consistent support and that every individual Ukrainian gets help. And that's by us working with the Department of Levelling Up and Communities and local government to ensure that they get the system right, that they work with local councils, and that we have good partnership working and good provision on the ground. One final thing, it's positive that actually the Department of Levelling Up and not the Home Office doing this, because the Home Office have a terrible reputation for impoverishing people that are in the asylum system, for treating them as though they're pieces that are moved around a chessboard, and for failing to get their act together to house Afghans who are still languishing in limbo in hotels. So we hope that the Department of Levelling Up and Communities will work better because of its links into local government.
Well, and that's very encouraging, as you say. And I wonder actually if we could just kind of pause the discussion for a second, because we're getting lots of questions coming through. And I wondered if I could just, it feels like the right moment to bring in this question about the matching system. And we had one question, we had a couple of reactions to it. So allow me to frame that. And I hope I do justice to the questions that have come in from the audience as well. So really the central and essential question was, the matching system's not really working. And Enver, you were beginning to sort of talk on that. I'm going to stay with you, actually. If you could kick off, then keen to hear other voices from the panel. So in the 1930s, the Foreign Office officials on the ground issued simplified visas on the spot to Jewish people under threat. And we could revert to that approach very easily, argues the questioner. So at the least, can we pressure the government to allow us to set up a proper centralised matching scheme, which then also couples in some of these trauma and education resources as well? And I wonder if we could sort of start with that. And then I know that somebody else also brought in a remark on that. Forgive me, I've got all sorts of gadgets here. I've got questions coming in, chat functions. But the point that was made in response to that question was that the Refugee Council and other refugee support organisations provide wraparound supports to individuals, supporting also the mental health and the housing question, which has also come through in our conversation today. And has there been any consideration by government to consider and make provision for those who are matched with sponsors? And again, I guess this comes back to those ancillary but incredibly important services as well. And are sponsors capable of supporting individuals as part of that? So let's break that down. One is this system sufficient? Should we go back to the model? Can the government address that? And then also, how do these other services flow? Enver, coming to you first.
Yeah, so on the point about visas, as I said earlier, the government could do this. It's remarkable to have that history there from the person who's listening around what happened in the 1930s. But yes, they could create a simplified emergency visa scheme straight away if they wanted to. But they're choosing not to. It's a political choice not to do that. And they cite security, but I think that's a dubious reason, because you can do security checks when people arrive. On the matching points, the system that they put in place allowed, if you like, 1,000 flowers to bloom on matching. So, we've been in touch with lots of people at the Refugee Council. We've been in touch with lots of people who effectively have done their own match. They've found someone on Facebook, a Ukrainian woman with children. They've matched them, and they're going to be sponsoring them and hosting them. Of course, the risk with that is you don't have any control, you have no oversight, and there've already been instances of individual men making very inappropriate comments to women through matching, And then even, you know, there've been cases of the matching arrangement, the sponsorship arrangement breaking down because the individual Ukrainian family felt uncomfortable, the woman specifically felt uncomfortable about being in a home with a man that was making, you know, inappropriate comments and so forth. So what the government is looking to do, and we've been pushing the government to create some kind of oversight mechanism, if you like, some kind of system of kite mark whereby you identify the matching organizations that have been validated by government. And they are in the process of doing this. They're working it up. They're going to recommend specific organizations that can do matching, including some that we're working very closely with. There's already one that they have done called Reset, and anyone listening to this, tuning into this, if they want to go to a recognized matching organization, go to Reset, and they're going to do others. And they're going to create a system of light touch validation. It's probably not good enough in terms of complete oversight, but it's a start, and it should hopefully address the risks that people have outlined. Very briefly on the wraparound support, that's what should be happening. You know, local authorities should be commissioning the likes of Refugee Council, or either doing it themselves, to provide support through individuals that are trained, expert, can identify issues around trauma, issues around crisis before they emerge. But another gap, I'm afraid, is that government haven't committed to additional funding to the NHS or to every clinical commissioning group. So every GP has funding to do a health check, to actually sign up every individual Ukrainian, or additional funding to mental health services.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for your thoughts on that. And I wanted to bring in another question that's come through. And Olga, I'm going to put this to you, if you would. Well, first of all, Susie, thank you for your question, and love your remarks about the nature of the discussion today. I'm glad you're finding it informative and useful as well. And really wanted to draw on your question here, which is, why are the reasons, or why has the displacement of Ukrainians been so fast and extensive in this conflict compared to others? So Olga, that's kind of one part to you. And whilst we cannot say what the outcome will be in terms of governments and ongoing conflict, what are the long-term hopes, plans, and approach needed to help people to rebuild their lives? Olga.
So I think we're going to be studying this for years to come. So I don't think there's an easy answer to this question. I think two things are very important. There is a regional element. Most displacement does tend to happen in the direct neighboring countries, as is happening in this case. So in terms of where it's happening, but in terms of in terms of the numbers fleeing violence, I think it's the type of war that is being fought, the fact that civilian infrastructures, homes are being targeted. In fact, we know that mothers and children sheltering in a theater in Mariupol were targeted by a missile strike. So it is precisely because of that nature. And I think there will be years of investigation into the actual practicalities of this war and how it looked like, and how quickly it moved in those first few weeks, and how that resulted in the sort of displacement within Ukraine and also outside of its borders. I would like to just mention that according to our research, most Ukrainians do in fact plan to return home. And they are adamant about this. And I think when we work with them here in the United Kingdom, when we welcome them, when we think about their integration into our communities and the support that we provide to them in this regard, we also need to be mindful that they believe very strongly that they will be returning to Ukraine to rebuild their country. In fact, according to our data, we're talking about 90-something% of the population as it's surveyed currently, including those abroad. So this is this delicate balance that I think we also need to strike when we are providing wraparound support. And I don't know if local, whether it's politicians, policymakers, or community organizers, might understand that that is actually traumatizing to be told you will not be returning home, that it's unlikely to be so. So we really need to focus on your language, on English, not your Ukrainian language education for your children.
Right.
So I think it's that element, it makes it a very different, I don't know, and perhaps makes it a slightly different community that we're dealing with. And this strikes me as something that is still not really understood.
Yeah, and Maria, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well as you look at the kind of medium term, longer term horizon.
Yes, thank you. One of the #1 inquiries that I've been getting from Ukrainians who are in the process of waiting for these visas to finally get to the UK is worries about being able to get back to Ukraine, because a lot of people don't have international biometric passports. So they've been going through this horrific experience of traveling hundreds of miles across Poland to get to a visa application center. I mean, the whole experience is just unimaginable. But then their worry is because they will only have the, residence permit for the UK. As soon as they can, they want to be back in Ukraine, and they want to be rebuilding their country, like Ola has mentioned. And I've been in touch with a lot of Ukrainians now, and the story is the same from all of them. They're all following so closely everything that's happening on the ground, and they're desperate to go back. I have several friends now who are back, and one of them just arrived in Lviv yesterday, and there was the missile yesterday, thinking that Lviv was now safer because of the focus on the east of the country, but I mean, it really isn't safe across the whole country. So actually that is something that another very, very common inquiry is about Ukrainian schools, because yes, people want their children to learn English, but they want them to continue their Ukrainian education too. And, I think that supporting Ukrainian Saturday schools and, or just being able to continue education in Ukrainian should be an option for people. And another thing that I do think is important is trying for our general public to learn a bit more about Ukraine, honestly. And I feel I can say this because I'm not Ukrainian, and the level of ignorance that I had 10 years ago as an educated, really curious person, I find quite shocking. And a lot of what I've been thinking about over these weeks is just imperialism and the imperial mindsets that I had and still have. I still have very instinctual, quite imperialist sort of responses to things. And obviously now I think people firmly understand that Ukraine is not Russia, given what we see. But I mean, it's so funny because people just are constantly saying that they couldn't believe how well Ukrainians have resisted these attacks. And for anybody that knows Ukraine, it's not surprising, because this is such a strong culture, and and the history, the level of disinformation and Russian propaganda is very powerful. And I think there should be also some, especially now, for children in UK schools to learn a bit about Ukrainian history. We need to think about our own history of World War II, for example, where Ukraine, anyway, there is so much, there are so many gaps in our knowledge. And I think as we start to have more Ukrainians hopefully arriving in the UK, join the Ukrainian Institute London events. We are continuing to do a cultural program and trying to learn a bit more about Ukraine. By the way, Ukrainians really don't like it to refer to it as the Ukraine. It's Ukraine. There are other things like this with spellings and so on, and it's really important to respect the culture as well, I think. The educational aspects of being able to continue education in Ukrainian, and for kids that are joining UK schools, for the other kids in the class to be taught a bit about how to understand the situation is also important, and the list goes on.
Well, listen, Olga and Maria, it's been wonderful to hear your thoughts about what this means in terms of lived reality, minute by minute, day by day, and also the nature and the collective, individual and collective nature of the diaspora and their passion but also their contribution to the UK as well. I'm concerned that as I make some closing remarks, that I will actually not do due credit to your comments. So I'm going to come to each of you, if you would, to leave our audience with some closing thoughts. But before I do that, I just want to take a moment to thank the audience for joining us, and also for all those questions as well. I just also want to make one remark, which is clearly when we were talking earlier about the immigration welcoming Jewish diaspora into the UK as well. We understand, of course, and respect entirely that individual stories may not be reflective, reflect the collective reality. There were obviously some horrific learnings and realities of that time, which I think, Enver, as you're thinking about, you know, engaging with the government, of course, it is a great moment in history to reflect on the good and also perhaps what didn't work quite so well. So I just want to acknowledge that. We had one comment in the chat about a family reality on that. So listen, let me come to you all, if I would, with kind of closing thoughts as you sort of part us today, and to the audience who have joined us. What might your ask be? Olga, can I come to you first?
Well, I think we've highlighted several dark realities of the situation and pain points in the process of matching, applying, and arriving. But we've also highlighted some success stories, both on the government side, the capacity to act, perhaps not as quickly as we would have liked, but nonetheless, I think the Homes for Ukraine scheme was quite positive. But here, I think what has been most positive in that we've seen over the last month and a half is this cooperation between existing organizations with loads of expertise, such as the Refugee Council, and a broad cross-sector community base, whether it's academics and experts or community organizers that are, you know, a women's business league of Ukrainian women, a scouting organization, many different organizations of different stripes. And it's so refreshing to work with specifically Enver and Renae, that we've been speaking about this for quite some time, because they have centered and sought to center Ukrainian voices. And they have made connections to wider, more representative groups across the United Kingdom, including Ukrainian groups. And when experts have a proven track record, but nonetheless are able to offer help and guidance to community members and do so with humility, nuance, and respect, they are not only able to figure out what's going wrong, which is so much of our conversation has been about, but think about what more can we do. And I think this is where we are at. This cooperation and this ongoing work together and centering Ukrainian organizations and experts who know what they're doing. I think that's where we are at.
Mm-hmm. And Maria, can I ask you for your final thoughts as you talk out to the audience? You know, what would you ask for? Oh, you're
sorry, unmuting myself. I really would encourage people to donate to the Refugee Council. I think that the Refugee Council really is doing crucial work. And I think, as Ola said, and as we've kind of discussed throughout the talk, I think this synergy between Ukrainian community organizations and charities like the Refugee Council that have years of experience is going to be really crucial. And we also very much hope that the government will put in place more systems. But I think the Refugee Council are very, very well placed to be lobbying the government for that, because you guys really understand what those systems need to be in a way that I don't, for example, honestly. I know that what we have now is not working, but I don't know what all of the systems that need to be in place. And so I think probably the one thing is to donate to the Refugee Council, and that's also why we're here today.
Right, well, wonderful. Thank you very much, Maria. Renae, I'm going to come to you just for your quick fast thoughts, and then I'm going to leave the last word with Enver, if we may. You were talking earlier about capacity, the capacity challenge. I'd love to get your thoughts about, you know, what would your ask to the audience be?
Again, it's about how we invest in those organisations at the front line, not just their capacity to be able to provide that crucial frontline response in terms of one-to-one support, but how they also crucially work together, and particularly around centering that response around the voices and needs of people from Ukraine. I think that's absolutely crucial. It's that long-term investment in the system. And when we do that together and we're stronger together collectively, then we can raise our voices together, because that's how change happens, both in terms of operational capacity, but also in terms of advocating for policy change too.
Wonderful. And Renae, thank you for all your work and for your extraordinary contribution today, which has been really valued. Enver, let me come to you for the final thoughts. We've talked earlier about, you know, what you think the government should certainly focus on as well, and your call out to the audience, how they can support as well. And you're on mute, by the way.
I think there's a remarkable opportunity here, actually. I think it's incredible the generous support that's been offered by so many companies, businesses, corporates, wanting to reach out and do their bits, by the British public, not just the more than 200,000 now, I think, that have offered to host, but their friends, those in their communities. You know, I read about a whole village in Oxfordshire that was coming together, all 70 houses in a very small village. I think this is a huge opportunity to bring people who've never really engaged with refugee issues to understand what it means to be a refugee, and then to advocate for the plight of refugees, and for them to understand that this government is trying to differentiate between the ones that it sees as the acceptable, the good refugee, the ones it sees as the bad refugees coming across the channel. And for them to become advocates for the plight of refugees is a great opportunity. So I call out for people to do that within their own networks, their communities, those they live with, they work with, those they know.
Wonderful, and what a great way to finish off as well. I know that there are enormous resources available at the Refugee Council. Thank you to everybody for tuning in. Thank you for joining us today. It's been a widespread, it's been a real reality check. It has given us a sense of the scale and the momentum, the relentless momentum of this challenge. And it's also been very inspiring in terms of thinking about very practical ways in which you can support. Maria and Olga, how wonderful to have your company today. Thank you so much. And Renae and to Enver, thank you for all your work. And to everybody who's tuned in, thank you for joining us. I've been Julia Streets. It's been great to have your company, and we really appreciate your questions and your engagement. Thank you for joining us.